Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is Robert Yates. Robert Yates is famous for being one of the two delegates from New York to walk out of the Constitutional Convention. So Robert Yates was essentially a self-made man. He trained to be a surveyor, and as I've mentioned before on this channel, surveying was a great way to go from being middle class to upper class. Famously, George Washington used surveying to enhance his lot in life. So, Robert Yates becomes a surveyor, and becomes successful, makes a little bit of money. Then he studies under William Livingston, a future other delegate of the Constitutional Convention, as well as a longtime future governor of the state of New Jersey. He studies under Livingston the art of law and becomes one of the most important lawyers in colonial Albany. In fact, he writes the first book that is a general assessment of Albany's laws to help not just future lawyers study, but current lawyers use it as a reference when they're studying for their cases. So Yates becomes a leader, and when the American Revolution seems to be breaking out, he is not a son of liberty in Albany's Sons of Liberty, but he is a member of the Committee of Correspondence for Albany. And because of this, he becomes very important. When independence is declared, Robert Yates is actually one of the people who sits on the committee that drafts New York's first constitution. Now, he spends most of the war in the early 1780s working in New York, and for New York State, as many people did. Again, at the time, under the Articles of Confederation, people viewed their state as more important than the nation. But when a convention was called to amend the Articles of Confederation, well, Robert Yates is one of the leading minds in New York State, one of the leading legal minds, that is, in New York State. He was sent to the Philadelphia Convention, as they called it, or as we know it today, the Constitutional Convention. And now he showed up with two other people from New York, Alexander Hamilton and John Lansing. Now, Lansing and Yates were very close, and they showed up thinking they were just changing some of the Articles of Confederation, but lo and behold, Hamilton and Madison and the Virginians and Pennsylvanians had a different plan. We're going to write a brand new government. And Robert Yates said, "What? No thank you. New York is doing just fine." Because you could tell, though New York was not yet one of the most populated cities or states in the young country, it obviously was growing, and New York City was clearly becoming an important hub of trade in North America. So, Yates said, "No, I don't think so," and he fought against it a little bit, although not very strongly. He mostly remained fairly quiet in the convention, just kind of brooding. And by the end of July, 2 months before the Constitution would be signed, Yates and Lansing both said, "We're out. There's no way the people of New York will accept this. Goodbye." And they left. And this is a shame, mostly because other than James Madison, not a lot of people kept notes, but Robert Yates kept very good notes of the convention, and we still use those notes to study the Constitutional Convention now. But unfortunately, he only took notes through the first half of the convention because he did return to New York State. He and John Lansing went back to New York, and they contacted their friend, longtime governor of New York, George Clinton, and said, "Hey man, they're trying to take our power. Like, you're our governor, they're trying to take over." And these three men became the leading Anti-Federalists in New York State, and some of the leading Anti-Federalists during the ratification conventions through the ratification process. In fact, they were so important that several of the pseudonyms that people used to write Anti-Federalist papers, many believe, although we'll never be certain, that Robert Yates wrote several of them, and if he didn't write them specifically, he was certainly consulted while they were written. And they were so important a force against the ratification of the Constitution that when Hamilton and Madison and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, they wrote them in New York, and they were almost all addressed to the people of New York, because it was such a hotspot for Anti-Federalist sentiment, and because New York would have been so important to the Union. At New York's ratification debates, Robert Yates was the #1 advocate against ratifying the Constitution, and unfortunately for him, fortunately for others, the Constitution was accepted by the state of New York. And Robert Yates did something that the people did back then that we don't really see too much of now. There's a quote from the signing of the Declaration of Independence by, his name is Robert Morris. Robert Morris said, "It is up to someone to, quote, follow when they cannot lead." And this is essentially what Robert Yates did. He was outvoted. New York had a very close race to ratify the Constitution. He was outvoted. And he decided, well, I'm going to support my country anyway. So what he did is he took an oath of allegiance to the United States to say, hey, I fought against this tooth and nail. I walked out of the Constitution. It's not even that he didn't sign the Constitution. He left halfway through. But he wanted to prove he would still work to support it. Now, he never did work in the federal government, but he did work in the New York State government, eventually being on the Supreme Court, and he ran for governor twice, though they were both losing races, and then he was even nominated and accepted as New York's Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, which is one of the highest offices in the state that he cared about so deeply that he thought would be more important than a national government. So that's the story of Robert Yates. It's a little long today, I apologize, but I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, definitely hit like. If you didn't, hit like anyway. Also, subscribe, because I put out videos like this 5 days a week, including on Wednesdays, I do a live video where we discuss the 7 founders of the day from the previous week on my website, founderoftheday.com. That's tomorrow. Definitely come. It's about an hour, and you can ask questions. We have a lot of fun talking about the American Revolution. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you live tomorrow.